you have something that we all thought to be true, only to be told that it wasn't, only to realize that maybe it actually was.
Hey, CNFers. It's the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, and I'm your host, Brendan O'Mara. Hey. Who do we have today? It's Ben Cohen, an NBA writer for the Wall Street Journal. He's the author of the new book, The Hot Hand, The Mystery and Science of Streaks. It's published by Custom House. Before we get to that, how's things? We're in shelter-at-home order here in Oregon. It's still weird, but we're doing okay. I've got this ear infection thing, but that's just dumb luck. And trying to work through that. Of course, that's why you subscribe, to hear such crap like that. Of course, if you want to subscribe, despite me talking about an ear infection, you can always head over to Spotify, Apple Podcasts. You know the jam. Also, hey, did you hear last week I put out an announcement, a call for submissions? We want your work. CNF Pod is putting out its first audio mag. I want essays on this theme, social distancing, essays from and on isolation. Submit your essay of up to 2,000 words max. That's about a 15-minute read to creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com. Deadline is May 1st. I'm serious, man. Gotta do it. Show me your best. Also, be sure to head over to BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey, for show notes and to subscribe to my monthly newsletter where I give out reading recommendations, articles, and what you might have missed from the world of the podcast. I'm also raffling off books I receive to lucky subscribers. So go subscribe so I can send you a book once a month. No spam. Can't beat it. And I'm really, I'm not alone in this, but I'm just super, super tired. So I'm not going to draw this out much longer. Ben Cohen, at BZ Cohen on Twitter, wrote a great book that is kind of Gladwellian. He takes this notion of the hot hand and overlays it across all kinds of subjects. It's a fascinating read, and Ben's a fun guy. So here's my conversation with Ben Cohen. Yeah, it's got to be really unmooring, I imagine, for the sports writers out there, just because unprecedented situation that essentially, you have nothing to write about anymore. It's got to be really disorienting for you, I imagine.
I think a little bit, but I don't think it's any more unmooring than anybody else. And in fact, I think that there was this initial shock of oh, what are we going to write about? When in fact, there's a lot to write about as leagues and teams try to figure out what's going to happen. But I don't think it's just sports. What are food writers going to write about for the next 4 months with every restaurant closed, or movie writers, or I just think we're in uncharted waters. And it was easy. I think it was this very glaring thing early on, because it's well, there are no games anymore, but there are no restaurants open, right? Movies are being shut down, TV shows are not being made. I think that's going to await everybody who writes about culture generally.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's definitely it's fluid and something that none of us have experienced before. So everyone's just trying to get their footing, and good work is still getting done. It's just people are, as a species, we're quite adaptable. So we're finding ways to generate things, to write things, to make things, to make beautiful things, and to engage in the culture in this particular moment.
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought of my sports writing as beautiful things that helps the culture. So,
well, I think that would be a good place to go back, because I think when I was doing some of my research, what I found so really cool about your early life is that when you're 8, 9, 10 years old or so, you're reading the Star Ledger, and it connects with you on a level where this was the thing you wanted to do. So what was that? Being a kid, reading the newspaper, reading the sports section, what was it about reading those stories that connected with you so much?
I don't know. I was a very strange kid. I mean, I think most kids dream of becoming astronauts and flying to the moon, and I dreamed of like covering Rutgers basketball for the Star Ledger one day. And I don't exactly know. I would read the Star Ledger sports section with my Lucky Charms and like toasted bagel, and it just was this ritual that I fell in love with. I always was obsessed with sports as a kid, but in addition to loving sports, I just loved journalism. I mean, I had like the best American sports writing books on my shelf when I was like 10, 11, 12 years old. I just knew that I wanted to do this. And what better way to do it than to read the people who were actually doing it? And the cool thing about the Star Ledger back in those days, I'm sure this was every newspaper, but I was 11 years old in New Jersey, and so the Star Ledger was the only thing I knew. Was that every day on the inside cover of the sports section of the paper, they would ask a question. Now it was just like the most basic question, like they would take like the story of the day with the Yankees, and they would ask some like reader prompt, and they would publish anyone who wanted to write in. I mean, I think that they had some level of like discerning quality, but the fact that like I was 8, 9, 10 years old and getting published means that there probably wasn't much level of discerning quality. So I would see my name in the newspaper like every day. I mean, not every day, but like many times a week. And no one knew that I was 8, 9, 10 years old. They just knew that I was Ben Cohen from Livingston, New Jersey, and these were my first clips. I mean, they were like 1, 2, 3 sentences with just, I can imagine like the hottest takes about, the Yankees and the Devils and Rutgers basketball. I mean, I would never want to read them now, but it was this very early, odd experience writing about sports for people to read. I would never have thought about it that way at the time, but it was very cool for me then, as it is very cool for me now, to just see my name in the newspaper.
Do you remember what your very first one was?
No, I wish. I mean, it was probably something stupid about Rutgers basketball. I mean, these were not. I was not exactly writing the Grapes of Wrath in the Star Ledger every day.
Who is these days? And you mentioned Best American Sports Writing, of course. So who were some of the writers that you were reading, coming up that inspired you? And you're like, yes, one day if I work hard enough and get that break, that I can be humming alongside, these fill in the blank. Who were some of those guys?
It's a great question. Well, I would read Sports Illustrated, and this was a time when I sort of I would read stories and then I would notice bylines, and I think I probably had the same progression as a lot of people, which is like, read Sports Illustrated and love Sports Illustrated, and then read New York Magazine and The New Yorker and things like that. Probably like the two or three writers that I really admired and wanted to emulate once I like could figure out what exactly they were doing and why it was so good. The first was a guy named J.R. Moringer, who published this memoir when I was in high school that's called The Tender Bar, and it's about essentially growing up in a bar in Manhasset, Long Island. And J.R. had written a bunch of sports stories that I had loved. He wrote this really incredible sort of famous profile of Pete Carroll, the old USC football coach and now the coach of the Seattle Seahawks, that's called like 23 Reasons Why a Profile of Pete Carroll Does Not Appear in This Space. And it's this funky twist on the profile, but it's just like brilliantly reported, and it's so fun to read. And I just think he's like the most lyrical, beautiful writer. And so he was definitely one. And then honestly, like I read Moneyball by Michael Lewis when I was in high school too. And then I went back and read all of his magazine stories, read all of his books, and I just think he's the master. I mean, in terms of the counterintuitive stories he finds, the oddball characters he writes about, the writing itself. I mean, he's so funny. There are hilarious sentences on every page. But the narrative scope of the book, I mean, he's just a genius. And he's like, in my book, I write about this 5th generation sugar beet farmer named Nick Hagan. And Nick, before he was a farmer, he was a Juilliard trained trombonist. And so we were like sitting on his wheat combine on the border of Minnesota and North Dakota. And, sometimes I write to classical music, or I like to think that I should write to classical music. And so I asked him, like, who are the composers? Like, who are your guys? Who should I be listening to? And he said, like, I know this sounds silly and maybe even cliche, but like, it's Mozart, and Mozart he's the best, he's the master, and like, people love Mozart, but I appreciate Mozart. Like I know why he is so good because I've played his music and I've studied his music, and there is nothing comparable. And I sort of feel the same way about Michael Lewis. Like everybody loves his books, and everybody will like buy his books in airports, but like if you're a writer and you try to do this type of thing, I think you sort of appreciate and understand the level that he is writing about, and like the insanely difficult bar that he passes like every time he writes a book. It's uncanny, it's extraordinary, and like I still go back to his books and just sort of read them when I'm feeling stuck, because they're inspiring.
Yeah, and you're getting to a point where, or alluding to a point where I think it's important as writers and readers to not just be inspired by the work of the people we admire, but also to take it to the next step and start to deconstruct about the work, what it is that they're doing. And when you're unpacking what Mo Ringer, or in this case Michael Lewis, is doing, like what are you seeing on a mechanical level? You're like, okay, this is, if I'm reading this closely, this is how he's doing it, and maybe if I'm humming on a good cylinder, I can start to apply some of these tactics myself.
Well, I like to think of it as the story itself and then the writing of the story. And so the story itself, I just think there's a very high bar to pass. I mean, that's sort of what I've learned from Michael Lewis's books, is that like that guy can write about anything. And when you have the freedom and the luxury and the power to write about anything, just choosing what that something should be is really important. It has to be like a brilliant story that appeals to a lot of people. And that's actually something I've learned at the Wall Street Journal covering sports, that I have to write about sports for people who know everything about sports, and also for people who know nothing about sports. And ideally, a good story will appeal to both of those groups. That's really hard. That's a hard needle to thread. And yet I think that there's no one who does that better than Michael Lewis. Like he can write a book about what is essentially a bunch of baseball sabermetricians that has become like maybe the most influential business book of all time. He could write about credit default swaps in The Big Short, and left tackles in The Blind Side, and high frequency trading in Flash Boys. And you don't need to know finance or sports. You don't need to be a psychologist studying Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman to love and appreciate The Undoing Project, right? And so, and yet if you are, you will love that book too. And I think that it's so rare, and it's something to aspire to. And then the other thing is just the writing, like on the sentence level. I just think you have to give people a reason to keep reading all of the time. And so there are a bunch of writers like that who are just like brilliant, funny. I think like humor is really underrated and is just so important. And just reading sentences you haven't read before. When I was writing my book, I read this book by Sam Anderson called Boomtown, that is ostensibly like a history of Oklahoma City. Now, I had never really thought much about Oklahoma City, and I never really had strong feelings about Oklahoma City, but this book was just perfect. I mean, it's just so delightful and engaging, and just it was actually inspiring to me, because when I would get stuck writing this book, I would just open up a few pages of that book and just sort of get me in the mood of how I wanted to write, because you could just see that like every sentence is crafted so perfectly. And I don't love talking about craft like it's something that like like it's something that you can only do if you're like slaving away at your desk at 2 a.m. after talking to like 850 people. I just mean that like you could tell that like why that book took a while to write, because like there's not a word or a sentence out of place. It's just it's and you could tell as a reader, like it makes you want to keep reading, and it makes you read something that you didn't know that you were interested in reading about.
Yeah, I love that idea of, if you're feeling stuck or you just want some inspiration to put another track in your head, put another song in your head. I just looking at your bookshelf and you'd be like, I'm feeling a little stuck, or I just like I need a little, my creative momentum is slowed down. So you just like look over your bookcase and you're like, all right, I might pull this book down by Tracy Kidder and read read a passage or two. Or as Glenn Stout might say with Best American Sports Writing, he's just like, pick up the volume and shotgun leads. Just look at the leads. Just rip through them and see what happens. Not to copy them, but to just draw inspiration from them. And I imagine that's what it's like where musicians, maybe they're stuck. And you're like, you know what, I'm going to go listen to Ride the Lightning and just try to get those riffs in my head because that might unlock something within me. So I love this idea of you just like pulling down that book and be like, all right, I want to get the rhythm of this guy's sentences in my head because it's going to help unlock something in me.
Yeah, it's like the cadence and the pace of it, right? It's not like the words itself. It's just like the rhythm of all of it and the voice. I mean, I am still I think I have something of a voice from I've been writing at the Journal for 10 years. I've internalized the writers of the Journal who I love. Like, I learned how to write newspaper stories from this brilliant editor named Sam Walker at the Wall Street Journal, and I read Jason Gay, who I think is probably the funniest writer on the planet. Like every day, I aspire and to be those types of writers. And like sometimes the best way to write like them, but in your own voice, is just to read them, just to get them in your own mind. And so, especially when I'm feeling stuck, I have found that that is a good thing to do. And it's just sort of like it's like cross training a little bit. It's just it helps in an odd way do what you are trying to do.
And and voice is such an elusive thing. How have you, over the years, being a teenager obsessed with newspapers and wanting to be a sports writer and consuming these brilliant writers, and of course the years of grinding over your own work, how have you cultivated what you essentially would consider your own voice on the page?
I think I've been edited really hard at the Wall Street Journal for 10 years. I know what it takes to get a story into the print edition of the Wall Street Journal, especially when I was like a 22, 23-year-old freelancer. It was really hard. And so the story had to be really good and the writing had to be super crisp and funny and fit this sensibility of this section that we were trying to build from scratch in 2009. 2010. And I think the best thing that happened to me, even though it drove me crazy sometimes, was that I got edited really, really hard when I was just coming out of college. And there are a lot of newspapers that don't do that sort of thing. There are a lot of websites that don't do that sort of thing. Yet I would file stories that would just get completely rewritten top to bottom. And my name would be at the top, and they would always or almost always be better, and they would be the writing would just be of a quality that was much higher. And eventually, when you get edited that much, you start to realize what a story should read like and what writing should sound like. And so working for the Journal in those days, being edited by Sam Walker, reading Jason Gay, I mean, that made all the difference for me, because if I had gone somewhere else where I did not have the privilege of being edited so it was a hard edit every time. You never quite knew what the story would come back to you reading like. And yet eventually you start to internalize that and it becomes your own voice. And so I feel really lucky about that. I would never have thought it at the time. It drove me crazy. I wanted to pull my hair out, but it was this huge advantage because I know now what I aspire to sound like when I'm writing.
That's the fact that you said it. When you the minute you said being edited hard, I just started scribbling down. I'm like, all right, how do you, and I actually wrote down internalize, and it's great to hear you that actually echo that word. I was just like, how do you internalize these edits, especially when you turn in something that you feel is like, all right, this is pretty good, and then it just gets absolutely hammered by your editor, like in the best possible way, just trying to elevate the work. How did you, over the course of being edited hard, as you say, use that as a way to get inspired to do better work instead of maybe get a little demoralized by the process?
Because I knew yeah, it's funny because, it was demoralizing when you would get a read back and you wouldn't recognize any of your sentences in there. But it wasn't hard to internalize because the sentences were usually better. Like they were the editing was making my stories better, and I could see that. And especially when I would go back and read them a few days later, it was easier to read them with fresh eyes. And so I wanted to sound like the way that my stories were reading. And I think I was coming into my own a little bit and understanding what my voice sounded like. Like when I was in college, I would write columns for my school newspaper, and I would emulate like columnists who I grew up reading. And I'm not a good columnist. Like I don't have strong opinions about things, let alone sports. It's hard for me to feign that sort of like outrage or I like writing about things that interest me and that I find curious and odd and funny and interesting. And it's hard for me to pretend otherwise. And so, the great thing, the super lucky thing about writing for the journal and writing this book is that I generally get to write about things that interest me. I'm not good at pretending otherwise. I'm not good at like there are certain reporters at the paper who are just brilliant investigative reporters who get to the office and call 20 people in the morning every day and just sort of kibitz on the phone and are good schmoozers. And I'm not good at that. I think I know what I'm good at, and that's like finding odd, interesting stories and writing them in a way that people want to read, even if they don't know they want to read it. And so I feel really lucky to be able to do that and to be able to do it in a voice that feels natural to me. I don't know if it was natural, but after 10, 12 years of writing stories this way, it has begun to feel a little bit more natural.
That's great to hear you come to this realization or come to this point where you kind of know who you are. You're not the hot take columnist or investigative reporter. You just follow your taste and your curiosity of finding those odd, interesting stories, as you say. Can you point to a particular moment where that just seemed like the guitar was in tune for you? You're like, yes, this is who I am, following my taste, and maybe that first odd, interesting story, you're like, yes, this is what I want to lock into.
I don't remember the first one. I mean, I remember one that worked, even though I didn't know that it would work, and it sort of convinced me that these types of stories would really work. And it was a story that I wrote in, I think, 2017. So I'd been doing it for a while at that point, and had a bunch of like stories that were hits, for a lack of a better word. But I wanted to write about this odd phenomenon in basketball, which is that teams were starting to realize that they should focus more on their shot selection, and they had to be smarter about the types of shots that they took. And so this started really in the NBA, where there was just this incredible data, and there were really smart minds who were trying to figure out how to optimize their style of play. I mean, there were clearly huge incentives for them to do this. This is what they were paid to do. But eventually that trickled down to college and even to high school. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool to find a high school team that was basically playing like the smart NBA teams? And so I asked a couple of companies that have data on shot selection for high school teams, and they sent me a few schools that were interesting, that had interesting shot profiles in their databases. And I sort of poked around, and there was one team in Pine City, Minnesota, the Pine City Dragons. It's this tiny town between Minneapolis and Duluth. You sort of drive, you fly into the Minneapolis airport, and then you drive a few hours in one direction, and then you end up in Pine City. And they were taking basically only three-pointers and layups. Anything in between, they had been systematically trained to not take. And so I thought this would be worth a trip, and it would be kind of fascinating to talk to the coach and to some of the players there and watch a game and see how this played out in real time. And that was it was a risk of a story, because I just did not know, like, do readers for the Wall Street Journal, this national newspaper, do they really want to read about this tiny high school in Pine City, Minnesota, that is doing something odd and a little bit unusual and having great success with it, but still it's a high school in Pine City, Minnesota? And what I found was that, like, the answer is yes, like, definitely. And that was one of my favorite stories that I've ever written, because it was one of I think the first times that I was able to take this idea that I wanted to pursue and find people who embodied that idea. And I was super gratified to learn that there was a really big audience for that type of story. And I had some fun writing it, but it was a story that appealed, I think, to people who knew that this was happening in basketball and also had no idea that it was happening in basketball, and really, like, don't care about basketball, or maybe don't even know what basketball is. And so that was one of the first times I remember coming back from that trip, writing that story and the story running and it getting this very nice response that I thought like this really works. I mean, there's nothing unique about it. I mean, I think really smart people have discovered that for a really long time before I did, but it was very nice for me to realize that I could pull off that type of story.
And so, as you're, going through high school, and of course, in school, I remember, in college, I think I read that you spent like ungodly amount of hours in the newsroom of your college newspaper, just getting those repetitions. So like where did you go to where'd you go to undergrad, and like how did you end up locking into the newspaper and just keeping that dream going?
I went to Duke, like everybody else from New Jersey, and working for the Chronicle at Duke was really the only thing I wanted to do. I kind of knew, in the same way that I knew reading the Star Ledger that I wanted to cover sports when I grew up. I knew going to Duke that I wanted to work for the school newspaper, and so from basically my first week on campus until my last week on campus 4 years later, I just spent a ridiculous number of hours in the newspaper office, and it was a really kind of amazing time to be at Duke. I arrived on campus a few months after the lacrosse scandal. There were just these incredible student journalists in the newspaper office. I don't know if it was because we were in the eye of this national storm, or if I just happened to be there at this really great time. But there were they were really smart people who are still working in journalism, who worked for the Chronicle at the time, and we put out a daily newspaper by ourselves. I mean, it took 70, 80 hours a week. I mean, it was really the only thing I thought about from the second I woke up until the minute I fell asleep at 3 a.m. every night. It was crazy. I don't really know how any of us survived. I think most people who work for a college newspaper will tell you that. And yet it was really some of the best days of my life. It was so inspiring to be able to do this thing that I always wanted to do. And to be able to do it in a place where people read. I mean, you would walk into class. This was right before everybody had an iPhone, and I would walk into class and everybody would have the print newspaper on their desk, basically, reading it while we waited for the professor to show up. Maybe reading as a stretch. They were doing the crossword in it, but still they had it in their hands, and they could potentially see the stories that I was writing. And it was so cool to write for this very small, closed community, but also write stories that reverberated far beyond that community. I mean, when you cover sports at Duke, you are competing with national outlets. And so I just can't speak highly enough about the Chronicle. And I do think people who want to do this and know they want to do this when they go to college, I mean, the best thing you can do is just sort of devote yourself to the school paper, because, my best friends to this day are people I met in that newsroom, and it really shaped what I do now. I mean, I wouldn't be where I am today if I didn't spend all of those hours and all those years in the student newspaper office.
I was actually in Durham during that time myself, just randomly. Was down. I had a buddy who was in grad school at Duke, and I had nowhere to be, having just graduated from UMass Amherst. So I was down in 2005, 2006 in that area, and I was a sports writer in Henderson, North Carolina, for a small little paper called the Daily Dispatch. And so I was in and among that during that time, and lived not too far away from the
house.
The house, yeah, it was probably a mile away from where I lived at the time. It was crazy.
Yeah, it was a crazy time to be there. And so my freshman year was the year in which basically the whole case fell apart. So I had the brilliant decision to attend Duke while, literally the month when it was the biggest story in the world, or it felt that way. And then I sort of saw the whole thing play out. So it was a crazy time. I mean, and one of the crazy things about it now is that, sometimes I go back to Duke and talk to students there, and they don't know about it. This event that was this seminal event in the history of the school, and played such a large role in my life and the lives of my friends. They were 8 years old when this happened. They don't remember it, and they don't really care about it. So it's one of those things about a college campus where just history changes every 4 years, and like something that happens when you are a freshman, by the time you're a senior, like the younger classes have no idea what you're talking about. It's one of the odd things I think about being around a college campus.
Did you work with Sayward Darby at all when you were there?
Yeah, so Sayward was a senior when I was a freshman, and so she was the editor of the paper the year before I got there, and was like in charge during lacrosse. Which is there are I think there are probably few stories that have been more interesting to cover if you are the editor of a student newspaper.
Yeah, she's been on the show, and she'll come on again this year when her new book comes out. But yeah, we were talking about that at that time, and the fact that that you were there at that time. I'm like, oh, maybe you guys overlapped in some capacity there. So at what point do you start snag that internship with Wall Street Journal, then freelance, and then get pulled on as a staff writer? What was the sequence there that brings you to the Journal?
So I was an intern in the summer of 2010. I was not hired. I interviewed for the internship, and I was not hired. And then the person that my editor did hire eventually took a job elsewhere, like a week or two before the internship was supposed to start. And so I got very lucky from the very beginning. And then when my internship ran out, I kind of kept my foot in the door and wouldn't let them close it on me. And so I freelanced for the paper for like 2-3 years, doing writing and editing and like really anything I could to just have my name in the paper and sort of be a presence around the office sometimes. And then finally, in the summer of 2013, a staff writer job became open, and I was hired for it. So about like 2-3 years after the internship, writing mostly for the Journal, but also freelancing a little bit elsewhere. And then I've been on staff writing about sports for the Journal ever since. So 7-8 years now. And I wrote about college sports at the beginning, and then in the summer of 2014, the day before LeBron James went back to Cleveland, we did not have a national NBA reporter at the paper at the time. And my editor called me into his office and said, I think that you should cover the NBA for us. And I said, Sam, I think that's because we don't have an NBA reporter, and you need someone to write the story about LeBron going back to Cleveland tomorrow, and you are not thinking more than 48 hours in advance. And he was like, no. I mean, maybe that's true, but also I think that we should be covering the NBA. I think it's about to be a thing again. And so ever since then, I've covered the NBA, which was a very lucky break for me because it was right before this sort of boom in NBA popularity and sort of this golden age of the modern NBA. I mean, I still haven't covered an NBA Finals that the Golden State Warriors weren't in. I thought this year would be different, but there might not be an NBA Finals this year, so the streak might continue.
That's great. Yeah. So as you start to get your feet underneath yourself at the Wall Street Journal, what is it that you find that as you're growing as you're developing as a writer and a reporter, and even still to this day, what is something that you still feel like that you kind of that you struggle with in a sense, and that you're always trying to work through and be like, all right, this is a weakness I need to kind of level up to my strengths?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm not good at like hard news stories. I'm not great at like calling people, blanketing sources with calls and calling people I don't know, and schmoozing with people and checking in with people at times when I don't need stuff from them. And so there are reporters who are really good at that, and I'm not. And I think what I am good at is sort of reading the stuff that everybody else writes and figuring out like the fascinating, revealing, interesting nuggets in their reporting that maybe I can take into mine and sort of use as the basis for a whole story. But I try to get better at it. Sometimes big news breaks, and I think that I'm pretty good now at offering like a smart next day story, or offering analysis or framing the idea in a different way. I mean, there are lots of ways to write things that nobody has written before, but I'm not great at breaking that news myself. Like there are people in sports, there are lots of people at the Journal who are just brilliant at like getting scoops, and they know how to get people to tell them things they shouldn't be saying. I'm not all that great at that.
Yeah, that's always something that, I'm like you, Ben. Like I'm more of the let's just sit back and let the frontline beat reporters do their thing, and then occasionally there's going to be this little nugget that they're like they can't afford to double down on because it's not totally germane, but that's like where the feature is. That's like maybe you waiting out Klay Thompson for 45 seconds to talk about a toaster, and like that's something they can't do, but that's something you can double down on because that's where your curiosity takes you, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. But also, I do work for the Wall Street Journal. We are like a daily newspaper. And so I do have to get better at that hard news stuff. And I think I have. I mean, there was a huge story a few months ago where the NBA basically found itself in this feud with China that sort of broke out overnight. And I think I did very well on that story because I think I recognized from the very beginning what a big deal this was. And I was able to sort of say things that other people weren't saying. But the other thing is that I've learned that it's important to take advantage of resources that are available to you. And one of the really just phenomenal things about working for the Journal is that we have incredible reporters all over the world. And so usually when I write about the NBA, I am, the only person from the Wall Street Journal in a locker room. ESPN and The Athletic have more people at specific games than we have in our entire sports staff. But the China story was actually one in which the opposite was true. We have bureaus in Beijing and Shanghai and Tokyo and Hong Kong and people who are familiar with Chinese politics. And I was able to work with them and collaborate with them to write really smart stories, I think, that other people weren't writing because they just didn't have the local expertise and the capacity to do it. And so I think it's really important to capitalize when you have advantages and recognize them. And that's an example. Like I'm super proud of the work that we did over those 2 and 3 weeks. And it's because it wasn't just me. Like I was able to work with people who are much better than me.
It kind of piggybacking off what you said you were kind of struggling with in terms of, being on, being like those beat reporters on the phone, 20 people checking in. How do you navigate the conversations among your sources where you're just kind of shooting the shit, just kind of seeing what's on their minds versus, okay, this is going to be more of an on the record thing. That's always a line that I find curious to unpack with reporters.
Yeah, when I figure it out, I'll let you know. I mean, I think I have relationships with certain people by now that they can trust me when they talk and they know I'm not going to burn them or I'm not out to get them. And I think people around the NBA and people who have read my stories understand the type of work that I try to do. And that I'm calling them for a reason. And the reason is that I think that they have an interesting story to tell, and I would like to be the one to write their story. But sure, there are plenty of times when people tell me things on background or off the record that I wish that they would feel comfortable bringing on the record, but they just don't. I mean, there are some people in the NBA. I mean, the best newsbreakers and the people who get scoops, I'm sure, report like 5-10% of what they actually know. I think I am much higher but that's mostly just because I don't know as much as they do. I go to my sources with very targeted, specific questions. And so it's very rare for me to have like a hour sit down with somebody that's just sort of wide ranging and broad, and I'll see what they say and then figure out what to make of it. I go to people when I have stories in mind and I ask them very specific questions. And so because a lot of times, like when I'm talking to NBA players, I only get 90 seconds with them. I get 2 or 3 minutes and I have to make that time count. And so I'm not asking them like, what was going through your mind when you made that shot? I am asking them specific things that hopefully they haven't been asked before.
How have you learned to really sharpen your focus and sharpen the saw to an extent, like to just circle back to that Klay Thompson thing where you're walking with him from the locker room to the bus essentially for 45 seconds, like you were able to synthesize something that was pretty that resonated with people in that amount of time. So like you got to strike when the iron is hot. So like what was that experience like?
Yeah, this was a story that I wrote a few years ago. The Golden State Warriors were on like an 18-game winning streak, and their fans were increasingly beginning to believe that it was because Klay Thompson had signed a fan's toaster the day before this streak started. And so this toaster had become like this magical talisman And so I talked to the guy who had the toaster, and he told me the whole story of it. And yet I knew that, like, if I'm writing this story for the Wall Street Journal, and actually ran on the front page of the Journal, like, I have to get Klay Thompson, like this guy with the magic pen, whose autograph started all of this. And it's not easy to get Klay Thompson during the NBA playoffs, and it's especially not easy to get him by yourself. I mean, it's if I had asked this question in a scrum or at a press conference, well, I just couldn't do that, because if he had said something interesting, then suddenly the entire world has it, and nobody cares about this story that I was going to write, because he has given it to everybody and it's on national TV. And yet, like, I needed to find some way to get him all by myself at a time when it's really hard to get NBA superstars all by yourself. And so what I did was I flew across the country. I went to the Warriors game. I staked out the locker room. I was able to track him after he did his post-game media availability until the time he walked out of the arena. So it was, I don't know, maybe 200 feet in this back corridor of Oracle Arena. And I walked side by side with him and said, I had to introduce myself, tell him the premise of the story, and then get him to say something interesting in the course of like 45 seconds. And so I sort of flew through. I'm Ben Cohen from the Wall Street Journal. I'm writing about this crazy toaster. And I don't remember exactly what I asked, but I know I spent a not insignificant amount of that 6-hour flight trying to like get the exact phrasing of that first question down. Because if he had just dismissed it or said, I don't know what you're talking about, or just sort of rolled his eyes, like, the story takes on a new meaning. And yet I knew what I wanted him to say, and I needed to get him to say it somehow. And so whatever formulation I was able to make on that plane, he played along with it. And literally it was a 45-second interview that ended with him pushing the doors of Oracle Arena open and walking out to his car. And I remember walking back through the corridor, back to the media room, just feeling like I was floating on air, because it was a really what had just happened was so absurd if you think about it, right? I had flown 6 hours, 3,000 miles across the country, had a car drive me from the airport to a basketball game, watched an NBA playoff game, staked out a locker room, and then walked with one person on earth for 45 seconds to get a quote for a story in the Wall Street Journal on the front page that doesn't exist if I don't get that quote. And so the stakes were really high. And it worked out, and like it was just it's this rush that you get. I mean, some people get it from scoops, and that's great, but I get it when, like, all of that planning for an idea actually pans out. And that's like, that story was ridiculous, obviously, and sort of silly, not sort of silly, very silly, and yet there's still this incredible amount of reporting that goes into it, and I think that's what makes those stories work. Like the funny stories, the ones that that seem a little bit absurd, you have to take the reporting just as seriously as, like, the serious stories, and that's what makes them sing.
And of course, what kind of triggers that is this 18-game winning streak, which of course kind of segues nicely into your book about the hot hand. And I love that the genesis of this book was you were writing a series of articles about the hot hand for the Journal, and usually you get, of course, you do enough reporting and enough research, you kind of get sick of stories. This one stuck in your craw to the point that you wanted to write a whole book about it. So take us to that moment where this story was just so irresistible to you that you needed to take an even deeper dive than you already were.
Yeah, and it's because, like, I love these types of books. I mean, I know some of them have a bad rap now, but just these books that take a single idea and use them to explore the rest of the world, I've always loved reading them, and I read them at a very formative age, and I always kind of knew I wanted to write one of them. And this idea of the hot hand was so alluring to me. So just on a pure story level, you have something that we all thought to be true, only to be told that it wasn't, only to realize that maybe it actually was. That was kind of irresistible. The characters in the story I knew were Nobel Prize winners and NBA superstars. That was also pretty irresistible to me. And yet all of these really smart people who had studied the hot hand for a really long time had done it because they were not writing about basketball. They were writing about human behavior, and they understood that you could use basketball to understand things far beyond basketball. And all of those things, I just knew that there was something here from the very beginning. Like there was something that compelled all of us for the last 35 years to think and to get a little bit crazy about the hot hand. Now, the question was whether I could take that one idea and apply it so widely that I could write a whole book about it. And I wasn't entirely sure about that until I actually did. But there was something that grabbed me, and I was told, I have a lot of friends who have written books, and there are a lot of people at the journal who have written books, and what most of them say is like you need to be willing to think about this for 3 years. Like it's going to be on your mind when you wake up, and it's going to be in the back of your mind all day. And like if you are just writing a book to write a book, it's not going to work. Like you really need to. There needs to be something that fascinates you about what you are doing. And I put off writing this book for like a year or two. I mean, I wrote a proposal, I put it aside, I kept coming back to it. And, really what drove me here was an emotion, I think, that drives a lot of writers, which is like envy and jealousy, which is that I knew if someone else wrote this book, I would be very envious and jealous, and I would never let myself, feel the end of it. And so I just decided, like, if someone is going to write this book, it might as well be me.
Yeah, that's I love that you brought up envy and jealousy. That's a lot of thing I talk about on this show too, about how that can be a driver, how that toxicity can is really no good in the end. But it's something that we all have to wrestle with in some manner. But it looks like for you, it was a great motivator, sort of the whip at your back to be like, if someone else does this, I'm not going to be able to live with myself.
No, and I mean, it's a quality of myself that I hate, but I'm super competitive. I was always competitive as like an athlete growing up, but I'm very competitive as a writer. And when I get when I have my eyes on what I think is a really good story, I tend to be fairly obsessive about it. Sometimes that means just writing it as fast as I can. Sometimes that just means like making sure that like sources who have talked to me will let me know if they talk to other people. I mean, I get a little bit crazy because I just don't want to see anyone else write a story, an idea, a narrative, a character that I have found and think could make for a really great story. And I think that's sort of what happened here. I just could not imagine someone else writing an entire book about the hot hand. It made me sort of crazy. And so I just decided, like, if it makes me this crazy, probably there is something there and it's worth pursuing.
And me being kind of a geek for this kind of stuff, when I read books of this nature, I'm always fascinated to flip to the back of the book and look at the notes and sources, everything that went in.
Yeah, it's the best part of the book.
Yeah, it's there's so much there, and I'm thinking like, and I love unpacking how writers go about organizing the research and going about it, and then being able to then make sense of it, so you can write a book that has such nice sort of continuity and fluidity to it, and it feels very effortless, though tons of effort go into it. So like, how did you get your head around all that research so you could synthesize something that comes out as good as the hot hand?
So I hired a research assistant, which I've never done before, but I actually was a research assistant for Andre Agassi's memoir, which J.R. Moringer wrote, right? And so what I did for them was I printed out every single story that had ever been written about Andre Agassi using LexisNexis, and I basically curated them. And so I had this stack of like, maybe 10,000 sheets of paper, and I cut it down to maybe like 500 to 1,000 sheets of paper that went into this binder that they could consult as they were writing the book. And it was this very small thing. I mean, it took a lot of work and a lot of paper and a lot of time, but really what it required were those three things. It required like unlimited printing and time and, access to LexisNexis, which when you were in college, like you have those three things. Those are like three of the only things that you have, right? Time and printing and like access to research services. And so I asked a Duke student named Hank Tucker to do the same thing for me. And so he printed out like every study that had ever been done about the hot hand, and there are hundreds of them, and he put them all into a binder and a Google Drive folder, which I guess is like the 2020 equivalent of a binder, and summarized them all. So he took the abstracts and he read them all and he put them into plain English. And so I had a pretty good sense of like the entire literature about the hot hand, not just the papers that like were specifically about the hot hand, but like the papers that cited those papers. And so I felt that I was on pretty good academic footing. But really, when I wrote this book, I knew the challenge, or one of the big challenges, would be finding the stories and the real people who, you know, could put human faces on this idea, who could sort of illuminate the phenomenon. And that's what I spent a lot of my time doing, is just reading super widely, asking everybody I knew for potential stories, and just trying to figure out, like, when you can write about anything, like, what should you be writing about, and what are the stories, who are the characters, how do I make this work? I did not want to write an academic book. I wanted it to be rooted in the idea, but I wanted it to be interesting to, like, my mom, right? Like, I wanted someone who does not read these sorts of books and is not like really all that interested in academic debates and scientific phenomena to appreciate this book on its own. And so once that research was done, I had to sort of do my own research and just figure out exactly what it is that I should be writing about.
So it could have been easy for you probably just to make this a sports book in hot hand, but you definitely find other ways to pull in the hot hand and this idea of streaks among other people, like the intersection of like luck and talent and circumstance. It's Rob Reiner and Rebecca Clark. It's asylum seekers. It's baseball umpires. They're NBA jammed. I mean, Van Gogh, Shakespeare. You were able to fold all those in. So how did you get all of those cross sections into this book? So it does have this sort of very 360 degree look at what it means to have a hot hand.
Yeah, I wanted it to be a big kaleidoscopic. Honestly, I don't know. Like, I have this like amnesia in like the 18 months that I wrote the book. I don't remember how I found a lot of these stories, which I think is actually what happens when I write just like daily newspaper stories for the Wall Street Journal. Like, I don't always remember the source. I remember like taking notes and just like putting them into a Google Doc and coming back to them later. And, I probably had 5 other ideas for every one idea that I wrote about in this book. But I knew the bar on these stories had to be really high. And I knew I wanted them to be as wide ranging as possible. I did not want to write a sports book. And in fact, like, chapter 1 of the book is about NBA Jam and it's about Steph Curry. And you've read the book. I think it's the most basketball that's in the book, and it just happens to be chapter 1. And I didn't know any other way around that, but I didn't want that to, like, I wanted the basketball to be even later in the book. So I wanted to signal to readers that this is not simply about basketball. And honestly, like, there was something selfish about that for me too. I mean, part of the fun of writing this book is that I got to write about things that I do not usually get to write about. And that was really thrilling. It was hard. I mean, but it was by far the most rewarding part of this process, to write about Shakespeare and World War II and Van Gogh and classical music and farming and investing. I mean, just things that I've never written about before. And maybe the people who do write about that stuff will say that it reads like that, but hopefully it does not.
Right. Yeah. And there was a particular line that you wrote in the book too that made me think about the overarching, or maybe it's the what Cheryl Strayed might call the subterranean river bubbling, rolling underneath the entire thing. And you would wrote this one sentence that was the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And that struck me, that this was a book about finding data and better data, and how data and the data collection evolves over time to illuminate, to shine new light on these timeless questions. Is that how the book ended up, sort of revealing itself to you over your research and reporting?
I think so. I think that, like, I did not want this book to be simply about, like, does the hot hand exist? Because I think that, like, part of the fun of all of this is playing with the idea for yourself and figuring out where you land. I wanted there to be, like, some deeper meaning to it. And to me, I found that meaning in this quest for data and better data, and like challenging our long held assumptions, and being open to data, to new data that tells us things that we've never heard before. And so the last two chapters of this book, the big narratives that sort of illuminate the ideas. One is about Raoul Wallenberg, the Holocaust hero, and these two men who went searching for him, and the other is about this long lost Van Gogh painting, and how a bunch of researchers were able to verify it like a century later. And those two things, they really have nothing to do with the hot hand, at least in the way that we think about it. But I think that they are illustrative of the lessons in this saga about the hot hand, and that's sort of why I wanted to write about them. And honestly, I also just kind of fell in love with both of those stories and the people involved with them, and I went looking for a way to write about them any way I could. And so I think that like they might seem like digressions, but they are like fundamental to the larger story here. And I think that like I have found that I think I have a pretty good nose for a story, and what interests me usually tends to interest readers. I think I have a good way of explaining why I am so fascinated by these people, and people will come along for the ride. And I hope that like those two stories in particular are good examples of that, because you might not know who they are or think that you have any reason to care about them, but hopefully I do a good enough job in the book of like showing why you should care and like why they're fascinating stories.
And maybe give us a sense of the difference between the hot hand fallacy versus the gambler's fallacy.
Oh, yeah. So the hot hand fallacy has always been studied through basketball, and it's when you make one shot and then another shot and then another shot, and you feel more likely to make your next shot. You are in the zone. You're on fire, right? So in basketball, like if you go into an arena and you see Steph Curry make 3 shots, everybody in the arena thinks that he is making his 4th shot. That's the hot hand. Something else happens when you walk into a casino. You go to a roulette wheel and you see the ball land on red 3 times in a row. What research has shown is that most people actually bet on black the next time. And that's the gambler's fallacy. And that was really intriguing to me. And there's a whole chapter in the book about the gambler's fallacy, because it seems to me that it's the same circumstances and yet completely opposite outcomes. For one, we bet on the streak to continue, and the other, we bet on the streak to end. And yet these are two really important biases that shape the way that we think. I mean, they're both sort of about judgment and decision making, and they're kind of equally powerful. And that was really the cool thing to me about writing about the hot hand, is that I wanted to present every angle of this idea. So in the book, it goes from thinking the hot hand is real to thinking it's not real to thinking that maybe it is real and there are times that we can take advantage. But that was part of that was also like, well, what's the corollary of the hot hand, and why does this matter, and why have economists and statisticians and especially psychologists studied this one like seemingly basketball phenomenon for so long? And it's because it's about judgment and decision making, and like it's a really complex topic, and I wanted to just sort of explore it, like every nook and cranny of it that I could.
Yeah, and taking the gambler's fallacy a step further is the really sobering element that judges that are hearing asylum cases will, if they grant asylum to one person, they might not do it for the next person just based on not breaking the streak. What was that like for you when that came up in your research, to realize that these are matters of life and death in the end?
Well, it's really crushing as a human being to read that, right? It's super depressing and demoralizing, and yet it shows the power of this idea. So there was a paper about the gambler's fallacy and decision making that looked at 3 distinct groups of people with authority, people who make decisions. One was loan officers, one was baseball umpires, and the other was asylum judges. And what they found, these Yale economists who looked at this, was that if an asylum judge has granted asylum 2 or 3 times in a row, he is much less likely to grant asylum to the next case, regardless of the merits of the case. That's crushing. Like, and it shows like the human consequences of these biases. As you said, like they are dealing with life and death here. It's not whether Steph Curry makes his next shot. It's whether a refugee gets to stay in the United States. And so I knew I wanted to write about this study because it was just such a beautiful example of this phenomenon that I was writing about. But I wanted to put a human face to that, and I wanted to show why it mattered. And so I read a lot about people who were applying for asylum, and I wrote about a guy in California who is this like brilliant artist and sculptor from Iraq who was applying for asylum. And to this day, he like still hasn't heard. His case is still pending. So it does not have like either the happy ending or the crushing ending. But I think the uncertainty is what makes it such an interesting story. It just sort of shows like these are not statistics or data; these are real people. And it sort of goes back to like one of the fundamental ideas in the book. I learned writing for the journal that tension is what makes every good story, right? Like the best stories, the ones we want to keep reading, are the ones with the tension, and we want to figure out how it resolves itself. And so I couldn't believe how much tension there was in this fight over a single idea. But, even in these stories that illuminate the idea, there had to be tension too. And this particular case, this refugee applying for asylum, I mean, I just don't think there's any more tension in any story in this book.
When you're vetting out stories worth pursuing, at least following your own taste, do you seek the tension first and then double down on your research and reporting?
Oh, that's interesting. I just tend to I tend to just like think about if I find a story and I can't stop telling people about it. I mean, I have a few people in my life who I bother all the time with these stories and say like, do you think that is this okay? Like, do you think there's something here? When I find that I can't stop thinking about it, then I pursue it from there. And sometimes I can't stop thinking about it because the tension. I mean, maybe that's sort of natural. But I don't really know. I mean, sometimes a story just catches my eye, and I can't stop thinking about it because it's just a great story. Maybe there's not a crazy amount of tension, but the character in the middle of it is so appealing and so intriguing. So I don't quite know. I mean, and listen, sometimes like I pursue stories and I make a few phone calls and I just realize that it's not quite there. So let alone like writing about that story in a book and like devoting a couple of years of thinking about it in a few thousand words. I mean, sometimes just for a newspaper story, it doesn't quite work. I almost wrote an entire chapter in this book about beer pong. I actually went to the World Series of beer pong in Las Vegas. And when I sat down to write it, I was just like, I just can't make this. I can't make it work. And so it was either a good idea or a terrible idea. I think it's a good idea that I did not write it, but there was something there. It just didn't work in the way I wanted it to. And one of the important things I think was just sort of figuring that out and not devoting a ton of time and resources to it.
And my friend Greg Hanlon, a couple years ago, and I think it's the 2015 ish edition of Best American Sports Writing, he had a piece in the main volume, which is incredible, and he also had a piece as a notable selection in the very same volume. And when I was talking to him about that, he was just like, yeah, this was like my Brady Anderson year from like 1996 when he had like 50 homers or whenever that was. And it got me thinking about wanting to ask you, of course, if you've experienced in your writing a hot hand period of time in over the course of your work.
I wish. I wish I had it writing this book. It would have made it a lot easier. I have felt it a few times at the Wall Street Journal. I don't remember quite what the stories were, but there were times when it just felt like things were going my way and stories were really easy to write and people were returning my calls, and it made me want to work harder. And I think that's one of the effects of feeling the hot hand, is that it's important to recognize when you do have it and to sort of double down and try to use those periods to elevate your career and maybe even change your life. Because the frustrating thing, the elusive thing about the hot hand is that it does not last forever. We know this. When it runs out, it's a terrible feeling. So in those times when you feel briefly superhuman, it's really important to take advantage. And I try to remind myself of that when I do feel hot, or when I feel even like a little bit lukewarm, is that like this is the time to really go all in if you can.
Yeah, there's a great passage in the book too. I think you're quoting somebody, but it's just like he or she says, I think it's a he says you can't know if you have the hot hand, but so you have to keep going. And so
Yeah, it's a very optimistic view. Maybe foolish, maybe like a little bit arrogant, but it is true. Like, if we do all have hot hand periods in our lives, what we think of as the hot hand period now, maybe in 10 years or 20 years, it won't be our hot hand period. Maybe it will reveal itself to be something completely different. So the only way to know if you're about to get hot is to just keep going, essentially.
And what do you think is the enduring legacy of the hot hand and streaks, and why there is so much literature on it? What is it about it that keeps enduring?
Well, I think there's something fundamental about like how humans make decisions and how we behave and how our intuition can play tricks on us, that is alluring to us. We all want to understand why we are the way that we are and why we behave the way we do and make the decisions that we do. But I think also like there's we all remember when we feel hot. We've seen the hot hand for ourselves, and many of us hopefully have felt it for ourselves, and we just kind of want to understand that feeling that so many of us are convinced is true. I mean, the other thing though is that I think we love stories, and we love the tension in those stories, and we love ideas and stories that help explain those ideas. And so like when I wrote the book, to me, the question of whether or not the hot hand exists, like it's almost besides the point. Like I want people to sort of come along for the ride and toy around with this compelling idea for themselves and figure out where they land. And maybe it helps understand ourselves a little bit better. I mean, there's a reason that really smart people have thought about this for a really long time and have come to opposite conclusions. There are brilliant people on both sides of this debate. And I think like the intellectually honest thing is to just kind of figure out what we think about it for ourselves. Like I'm a reporter, right? I'm not a researcher. I'm not like some self-help guru. I wanted to just tell a good story here that people would want to keep reading, and might help explain the world a little bit better if you read this book. So I think I actually think the book is pretty breezy, and it's like fairly short, and I think you can kind of plow through it pretty quickly. And I wanted that to be the case too. I wanted it to like be interesting, but also sort of effortless to read. So there's a lot, and maybe a lot is like, maybe I don't quite know what I want people to read or understand from reading the book. But, I think playing around with that idea for yourself is really where I land on it.
Well, this book was, like I say, it was a ton of fun to read. I enjoyed it from cover to cover. And, so, bravo on a great book, man. Best of luck with it. Where can people get more familiar with you and your work, Ben, if they're not already familiar with it?
They can go to my website. It's bzcohen.com, and there's all types of stuff about the book on there, and then a whole bunch of my favorite stories for the journal, including some that we've talked about over the last hour. And so that would be the best place. BZ Cohen, and I am BZ Cohen on like every social media platform that we're all trying to avoid these days.
Fantastic. Well, Ben, stay safe, stay healthy, and thanks for carving out the time. This is great talking to you.
Thanks so much for having me.
You got it, Ben. Take care. We did it. We made it, CNFers. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure you're subscribing to the show, of course. This crazy show is produced by me, Brendan O'Mara. Hey. I make the show for you. I hope it made something worth sharing. And if you really dig the show, leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Show notes are at BrendanO'Mara.com. Follow the show on the various social media channels at CNFPod across them all. Get that newsletter at my website. Win books, win zines, hang out with your buddy B.O. Once a month, no spam, can't beat it. Are we done here? We must. Because if you can do interviews, see ya!